From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I'll be signing an executive order imposing hard-hitting sanctions on the Supreme Leader of Iran and the Office of the Supreme Leader of Iran and many others.
As President Trump imposes new sanctions, Iran says the move will permanently close the path to diplomacy between the two countries. This comes as the U.S. carries out cyber attacks against Iran. We'll get the latest. Then to Oregon, where the state government is in a standoff after 11 Republican lawmakers fled the Capitol Thursday. Some fled the state to avoid voting on landmark climate change legislation. Threats of violence from right-wing militias supporting the rogue GOP legislators then led the remaining lawmakers to shut down the state capitol in Salem.
Today could have been a historic day for Oregon. House Bill 2020 was poised to come to the Senate floor. Unfortunately, Senate Republicans failed to show up and failed to do their jobs.
We'll go to Portland, Oregon for the latest. Then we look at the growing controversy over presidential candidate Joe Biden's refusal to apologize for his recent praise of segregationist senators.
There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career. Period. Period. Period.
We'll speak to longtime author and education activist Jonathan Kozol about his recent piece, When Joe Biden Collaborated with Segregationists. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump imposed new sanctions against Iran Monday, targeting the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and announced forthcoming sanctions against Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani derided the announcement, saying, quote, "You sanction the foreign minister simultaneously with a request for talks?" While Zarif tweeted, "Real Donald Trump is 100% right that the U.S. military has no business in the Persian Gulf. Removal of its forces is fully in line with interests of U.S. and the world. But it's now clear that the B team is not concerned with U.S. interests. They despise diplomacy and thirst for war," unquote. The B team is thought to refer to John Bolton, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The sanctions came after an aborted U.S. attack on Iranian targets last week, following the downing of a U.S. Navy spy drone by Iran earlier this month, which the U.S. says happened over international waters, while Iran maintains the drone had entered its territory. Iranian officials have since released imagery which they say confirms this. At a top-level meeting in Jerusalem between the U.S., Israel, and Russia, a top Russian official contradicted the U.S. narrative, saying it had, in fact, entered Iranian territory. Iran also said Monday it had blocked cyber attacks by the United States. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has traveled to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in an attempt to build what the Trump administration is describing as a global coalition against Iran. The Iranian ambassador to the United Nations told reporters he'd been shut out of a U.S.-led closed-door meeting of the UN Security Council. This is Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Majid Takht Ravanchi, responding to the new sanctions.
The U.S. decision today to impose more sanctions against Iran is yet another indication of continued U.S. hostility against the Iranian people and their leaders, and that the U.S. has no respect for international law and order, as well as the views of overwhelming majority of the international community. To ease sanctions in the broader Persian Gulf region, the U.S. must stop its military adventurism.
We'll have more on the U.S.-Iran story after headlines. The Department of Homeland Security said Monday they transferred approximately 300 children out of a Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas, following a shocking Associated Press report last week that sparked widespread outrage. Lawyers who visited the facility found children of all ages locked up without adequate food, water, sanitation, or medical care, with older children caring for younger ones. Clara Long of Human Rights Watch, who interviewed children at the facility, recounted a distraught child wearing a bracelet with the words U.S. parent and a phone number, but found when calling that phone number, her parents had no idea where she was or the condition she was being held in. Some of the children were reportedly moved into a shelter overseen by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, while others are now being held in a tent facility in El Paso, Texas. Around 30 children remain at the Border Patrol station in Clint, according to the office of El Paso Congressmember Veronica Escobar. The station is not designed to hold children for more than a few days, but many of the kids have been there now for nearly a month. You can see our interview with Warren Binford, a lawyer who interviewed the children at the Clint, Texas prison, at democracynow.org. Meanwhile, the FBI is investigating the deaths of 4 unidentified people, including 1 toddler and 2 infants, who were found by Border Patrol agents along the Rio Grande and Texas Rio Grande Valley near the U.S.-Mexico border. The bodies were discovered Sunday, but their condition indicated they could have died days before that. Investigators say the 3 young children and a woman in her early 20s appear to be migrants who died from dehydration and heat exposure, though official autopsy results have yet to be released. Separately, the bodies of a Salvadoran migrant and his 2-year-old daughter were found also Sunday on the Mexican side of the southern border near Brownsville, Texas, according to Mexican and Salvadoran news reports. President Trump responded to the firestorm surrounding E. Jean Carroll's allegation that he raped her in the 90s by telling reporters he would not have assaulted her because she's not my type, he said. An excerpt from the noted advice columnist's upcoming book accuses Trump of forcibly kissing, then raping her in the dressing room of Bergdorf Goodman department store in New York. Over the weekend, Trump said he did not know and had never met Carroll, despite a photo which accompanied the excerpt of her piece in New York Magazine showing Trump and Carroll together at a party in the 1980s. At least 22 women have accused Trump of assault or sexual misconduct. In related news, the New York Times executive editor, Dean Baquet, admitted the New York Times was overly cautious in his coverage of Carroll's allegations after readers took the paper to task for downplaying the story. The New York Times initially reported the story in its online book section Friday and did not promote it on its homepage until late Saturday or run a print story until Sunday. Officials and business leaders from the U.S., Israel, and several Arab nations are meeting in Bahrain today and tomorrow in what's being billed as an economic workshop designed by Trump's son-in-law, his senior advisor Jared Kushner, to address the Israel-Palestine conflict. Palestinian leadership has rejected the $50 billion U.S.-led initiative, the first phase of Kushner's so-called Middle East peace plan, which focuses on generating investment in the region while sidelining politics, the Israeli occupation, and Palestinian voices. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shataya said ahead of the gathering, quote, "This workshop is simply a political laundry for settlements and legitimization of occupation," unquote. Palestinians rallied in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip Monday to protest the event. This is Miriam Abu Daka of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
If they give us all the billions in the world, we won't sell our land. Our cause is political, ethical, lawful, and national. It is not for sale. It is a shameful deal. Not Trump, neither the Zionist can erase any right of the Palestinian people.
An unprecedented heat wave is gripping Central Europe this week, with temperatures in France, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany expected to hit 100 degrees and above, though experts say humidity will make it feel like 116 and higher. The highs will surge to 36 degrees higher than average for this time of year, setting records across French cities where experts say heat waves are on the rise in recent years due to the accelerating climate crisis. The French National Forecasting Service has warned record-breaking heat waves would continue to intensify and double in frequency by 2050 if global emissions are not drastically reduced. In more climate news, India's sixth-largest city has nearly run out of water. The 4 reservoirs that supply the 5 million residents of Chennai have nearly run dry, forcing many to use well water, which is not considered safe to drink, and water delivered into the city for those who can afford it. 21 Indian cities, including the capital, New Delhi, will run out of groundwater by 2020, affecting 100 million people, according to some forecasts. The water shortage is linked to the climate crisis, which has weakened the monsoon season and decreased rainfall in the region over recent years, worsening drought conditions. On Monday, the Supreme Court made it more difficult for journalists to access commercial information under the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. The case involves a South Dakota newspaper, which was refused documents by the U.S. Agriculture Department related to grocery stores participating in the food stamp program. The publication, the Argus Leader, was investigating fraud in the federally funded program. The justices ruled 6-3 against the newspaper, with Justices Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Breyer dissenting. The Committee to Protect Journalists said of the ruling, in order to hold institutions to account, journalists often need to petition the government to make documents public. Today's ruling will undermine the ability of reporters to access the information they need to do their jobs and is a blow to the transparency of the United States government, they said. In Oregon, state lawmakers are entering day 6 of a standoff after 11 state senators fled the state capitol last week to avoid voting on a landmark climate change bill. Some of the legislators are believed to be hiding out in Idaho. In an unbelievable turn of events, threats of violence from right-wing militias supporting the rogue Republican legislators then led the remaining lawmakers to shut down the state capitol in Salem over the weekend. Oregon Democratic Governor Kate Brown sent out the state police to track down the state senators last week. She said Monday she won't negotiate with the lawmakers until they return to Oregon's capital. The climate bill aims to decrease emissions by implementing a statewide cap-and-trade model. Without at least 2 of the rogue Republican state senators present, Oregon Democrats, who control the state Senate and House of Representatives, don't have the necessary quorum to vote on the legislation. We'll go to Portland, Oregon, for more on this story with Oregon Democratic State Representative and co-sponsor of the bill, Karen Power. In reproductive rights news, a judge ruled Monday Missouri's sole abortion clinic can continue providing the service through the end of this week as Planned Parenthood continues its fight to keep its doors open. Last Friday, Missouri health officials refused to renew the clinic's license to perform abortions. Reproductive rights defenders say the health officials' decision is politically motivated and reflects Missouri's move to restrict constitutionally guaranteed abortion rights. The case will now go before an administrative panel designed to resolve disputes between state agencies and businesses. Providers at the Planned Parenthood clinic warned abortion access in Missouri could be lost by Friday if the panel fails to act or favors the health department. 9/11 first responders are meeting with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell today to urge him to back an extension to federal funding for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. The fund serves those who became sick as a result of their work following the 2001 terror attack. Funding is set to expire next year. Earlier this month, the former host of The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, offered an emotional testimony before a House panel in which he blasted lawmakers for their inaction. Former Pennsylvania Congressmember Joe Sestak entered the crowded race to become the 2020 Democratic presidential nominee Sunday. Sestak, as a former Navy admiral, highlighted his military career in his announcement. His campaign video states his priorities as tackling climate change and restoring the U.S. global leadership. He said he wants to, quote, put an end to an illiberal world order's injustices, from China's control of the 5G network to Russian interference in democratic elections. Sestak entered the race too late to qualify for the first Democratic debates, which are taking place later this week in Florida. The Treasury Department's internal watchdog says they'll look into why a previously agreed-to redesign of the $20 bill featuring abolitionist leader Harriet Tubman will not be unveiled next year. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin came under fire after announcing last month he was delaying plans to replace Andrew Jackson's portrait on the $20 bill with Tubman. Under a 2016 Obama initiative, Tubman was originally scheduled to replace slaveholder Andrew Jackson by 2020, the 100th anniversary of women being granted the right to vote. Harriet Tubman would be the first woman in over a century and the first African-American to appear on the front of a U.S. banknote. And the U.S. women's soccer team and the U.S. Soccer Federation have agreed to mediation over a gender-based pay discrimination lawsuit filed by the 28 players in March. The suit also alleges the organization denies the women's team equal playing, training, and travel conditions and does not promote their matches as much as the men's soccer team. Figures from the U.S. Soccer Federation's own financial records show that in the 3 years following the team's victory at the 2015 World Cup, ticket sales for women's games generated more total revenue than men's games, a key argument in the lawsuit. The co-captain of the women's team, Megan Rapinoe, is also making headlines during the World Cup for refusing to sing the U.S. national anthem and put her hand on her heart ahead of the games. In the past, she's also taken the knee to protest police violence and racism. Rapinoe is also an outspoken advocate for LGBTQ rights. Being a gay American, she said, I know what it means to look at the flag and not have it protect all of your liberties. The U.S. team is heading to the World Cup quarterfinals this week, where they'll face off against France. The men's team didn't qualify. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration has imposed a new round of sanctions on Iran, targeting several prominent Iranians, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. President Trump announced the sanctions Monday.
These measures represent a strong and proportionate response to Iran's increasingly provocative actions. We will continue to increase pressure on Tehran until the regime abandons its dangerous activities and aspirations, including the pursuit of nuclear weapons, increased enrichment of uranium, development of ballistic missiles, engagement in and support for terrorism, fueling of foreign conflicts, and belligerent acts directed against the United States and its allies.
Iran said the move, quote, permanently closed the path to diplomacy between Iran and the United States. Earlier today, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani dismissed the sanctions as outrageous and idiotic and called the White House, quote, mentally retarded, unquote. The latest tension comes after the downing of a U.S. drone by Iran on Thursday. Iran maintains the spy drone had entered its airspace, while the U.S. claims the drone was in international waters. The U.S. military prepared to directly attack Iran in retaliation Thursday night, but Trump reportedly called off the bombing at the last minute. U.S. Cyber Command did respond by conducting online attacks against an Iranian intelligence group with ties to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. This comes as National Security Advisor John Bolton is in Jerusalem meeting with national security advisors from Russia and Israel. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has traveled to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in an attempt to build what the Trump administration is describing as a global coalition against Iran. Tension between the U.S. and Iran has been growing ever since President Trump unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal last year. Since then, the United States has repeatedly imposed increasingly harsh sanctions on Iran, even though Iran has remained in compliance with the pact. Joining us now is the U.S. Iranian author and analyst, Trita Parsi. He's the former president of the National Iranian American Council, the group he founded. His most recent book is titled Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. His latest piece for the New Republic is headlined, Could Obama's Iran Playbook Save Trump from War? Trita, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you respond to the latest, the newly imposed sanctions on Iran?
Well, if the Trump administration or President Trump himself actually wants diplomacy, then it is very difficult to see how this latest measure makes any sense whatsoever. This is not adding any particular economic pressure on Iran. In fact, already roughly 80 to 90% of Iran's economy is under sanctions from the United States. So there's really not that much left to sanction. I think what has happened here is that Donald Trump has been conned. He has adopted a policy of maximum pressure, which I think he may have thought was a good negotiating strategy. It's somewhat similar to what he did with North Korea. But the people who have been pushing this policy onto Trump do not have diplomacy in mind. In fact, they know very well that this strategy makes diplomacy very unlikely. In fact, it's designed to make diplomacy unlikely while making war with Iran extremely likely. And I think we saw a very good piece of evidence of that last Thursday. Because when push came to shove and Pompeo and Bolton had to choose between counseling restraint and counseling war, they counseled war. Trump's problem, though, is that while he has shown some indication of not wanting to go to war, he has not connected the dots of realizing that the reason why he's constantly on verge of war with Iran is precisely because of this maximum pressure strategy that he's adopted and that he's now taking to new levels by actually sanctioning the diplomats that he's supposed to be negotiating with.
Hours after President Trump imposed a new wave of sanctions Monday, the Iranian foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, tweeted, "Real Donald Trump is 100% right that the U.S. military has no business in the Persian Gulf. Removal of its forces is fully in line with interests of U.S. and the world. But it's now clear that the B team is not concerned with U.S. interests. They despise diplomacy and thirst for war," the Iranian foreign minister said. Trita, if you can talk about who the B team is, because it goes to exactly what's happening right now with Pompeo, the Secretary of State, headed to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and Bolton right now in Israel with Russia and Israel.
So the B team is something that Zarif coined a couple of months ago, and I think what he's referring to, the individuals that he's included in that concept is Bibi Netanyahu, MBZ, which is the Crown Prince of UAE, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and Bolton. And what he's referring to there is that from the Israeli side, from the Saudi side, from the UAE side, there has been a push to get the United States to confront Iran or go to war with Iran for more than 10, 15 years. We saw from the WikiLeaks documents that MBZ had been advocating the United States to bomb Iran for quite some time. The former king of Saudi Arabia was telling the United States to cut off the head of the snake. We saw that the former Secretary of Defense, while he was Secretary of Defense, was meeting with his French counterpart and said that the Saudis want to fight the fight the Iranians to the last American. So we have a situation in which these countries believe that if the United States were to go to war with Iran, it would restore the balance of power that existed in the Middle East prior to 2003. And that's what they're looking for. They want to live under this American protectorate and have the United States be a strong military hegemon in the Middle East. What is fascinating with all of this is that Trump himself seems to strongly disagree with that notion, yet he goes along with their recommendations, because the tweet that he had shot off yesterday pointed out that the United States actually is not buying oil from the Persian Gulf, yet it is paying all of the cost of protecting the sea lanes there, and that it should be protected by other countries, and they should be sharing the burden, the cost of that protection. And this is what I think Zarif was referring to when he said that the United States doesn't have an interest in remaining such a military presence in the Persian Gulf. But this is the crux of the problem. Not only is Trump's administration in conflict with itself, Trump himself does not seem to have an ability to hold one opinion at the same time for a longer period of time. He constantly contradicts himself, and it makes it very difficult for any side to figure out how do you actually negotiate with a Trump administration, if negotiations even are an option.
This is President Trump speaking to NBC's Chuck Todd after Todd asked Trump whether he felt he was being pushed into military action by his advisors.
I have two groups of people. I have doves and I have hawks.
Yeah, you have some serious hawks.
I have some hawks. Yeah, John Bolton is absolutely a hawk. It's up to him. He'd take on the whole world at one time, okay? But that doesn't matter because I want both sides.
So can you respond to this, Trita Parsi?
I don't know who the doves are. It's one thing to say that he has hawks. He certainly has hawks. But who are the doves? And if he actually is interested in diplomacy, who are the advisors on his team that at any point in their life actually have supported diplomacy, who have advocated for diplomacy, and who have any experience in how to actually conduct diplomacy with a country like Iran? He has surrounded himself entirely with people who have made a career out of making diplomacy, particularly with Iran, an impossibility, and who have at every turn advocated for military action. So the idea that he has two sides in his administration seems rather strange, because who are the doves?
Can you talk about what happened on Thursday night, the significance of this? I mean, you have Iran shooting a spy drone out of the sky. They say it's in Iranian airspace. Russia, apparently, in Israel right now with Bolton, has said they've got the images to prove it was in Iranian airspace. The U.S. says it was an international space. Then you have Trump apparently moving forward with an attack, but then saying when he understood that 150 Iranians would die at least in this attack and that the spy drone was unmanned, he called off the attack as the planes had already taken off. Although there was a cyber attack, the U.S. launched a cyber attack against Iran. Can you explain all of this, the significance of this, and if you think that the U.S. is still poised to attack Iran?
I think it goes back to what we said earlier on, that the strategy of maximum pressure is designed by some of these individuals to corner Trump and force him to take military action. And that's what they tried to do this past Thursday, and last minute Trump changed his mind. Now, he has publicly stated that it was because he felt that the response was disproportionate, one spy plane and then killing 150 people on the other side. I think a more likely scenario is that he realized that he would not be able to control the escalation that would happen afterwards. In fact, the United States has been close to taking military action against Iran on numerous occasions in the last 25 years. Almost every time, the reason why the president did not choose to go forward with that was because of a very clear reality afterwards. They would not be able to control what would ensue, and they would not be able to have escalation control. Very quickly, this whole thing could develop into a full-scale war. And I think that is something that Donald Trump realizes would be very problematic for him politically. This is the advice he also got from Tucker Carlson on Fox News while he was making his decision, which was that an attack on Iran, a war with Iran, would be the end of his presidency.
So at this point, you have France, Britain, and Germany warning Iranian officials about the serious consequences Iran faces if it reneges on the 2015 nuclear pact that the U.S. already pulled out of. Can you talk about what this means and the position Iran is in now and what you feel needs to happen on both sides, with apparently the Iranian people also blaming their own government as well as Trump for the sanctions, since they are crippling the population on the ground there?
So I think from the European perspective, Trump has clearly threatened Iran. He has crushed much of their economy, but he has truly humiliated the Europeans, because the Europeans have proven themselves to be of no consequence in this drama once Trump chose to go down the path of maximum pressure, because they were supposed to be providing the Iranians with the economic benefit that the deal was promising them. They have failed to do so. They object to the sanctions of Trump, yet they abide by them. But they're not actually in full compliance with the nuclear deal because they have abided by Trump sanctions, which violate this nuclear deal. So now they're threatening Iran that if Iran starts to pull out of the deal, Iran will face severe consequences. It's not really clear what severe consequences the Europeans would be able to impose on the Iranians, mindful of the fact that there is hardly any trade left between Europe and Iran, since the Europeans already have abided by the American sanctions. So I don't think the Iranians take the threats from the Europeans particularly seriously. But the Europeans may take seriously that this whole thing will escalate into a military conflict unless Europe, China, do far more than they have done so far to make sure that Iran gets the economic benefits that it was promised. If that occurs, then there's a likelihood that the Iranians will pull back and they will stay within the deal. That will not be an easy decision, of course, because the Trump administration will continue to try to provoke the Iranians to walk out of the deal. In fact, to understand what Trump is doing right now, what his administration is doing, one should take a look at the paper that Bolton published about 6 months before he joined the administration. They have really followed that strategy to the teeth. And one thing he makes very clear there is that while the U.S. should not be pursuing diplomacy, it should keep the rhetorical option of diplomacy open. And the choice of the word rhetorical, I think, makes it very, very clear that it's all about talking about diplomacy, but never actually engaging in it.
Trita Parsi, we want to thank you for being with us. Former president of the National Iranian American Council, the group he founded. His most recent book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. We'll link to your piece in the New Republic on our website at democracynow.org. When we come back, we look at the growing controversy over presidential candidate Joe Biden's refusal to apologize for his recent praise of segregationist senators. We'll speak with longtime author and education activist Jonathan Kozol. His recent piece when Joe Biden collaborated with segregationists. Stay with us. Classic education. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Democratic presidential candidates are preparing for the opening debates of the 2020 presidential race this week, with 20 candidates slated to face off in a two-night forum starting Wednesday. Former Vice President Joe Biden will participate in the second of the two nights, Thursday night debate, where he'll likely face questions about his recent praise of segregationists. He'll be debating, among others, Senator Sanders and Kamala Harris. Last week, Biden made headlines when he fondly reminisced about his civil relationship in the 70s and 80s with segregationist Senators James Eastland of Mississippi and Herman Talmadge of Georgia. Biden reportedly said, quote, "I was in a caucus with James O. Eastland. He never called me boy. He called me son." Biden was widely criticized by his Democratic rivals, including New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, who said, quote, "Vice President Biden's relationships with proud segregationists are not the model for how we make America a safer and more inclusive place for Black people and for everyone. Frankly, I'm disappointed that he hasn't issued an immediate apology for the pain his words are dredging up for many Americans. He should," Cory Booker said. Biden's refused to apologize for his remarks.
Are you going to apologize like Cory Booker has called for?
For what?
Cory Booker's called for it.
Cory should apologize. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career. Period. Period. Period.
He demanded that Cory Booker apologize to Joe Biden. While Biden's recent comments made the news, far less attention has been paid to the former vice president's actual record. In the 1970s, then-Senator Biden was a fierce critic of Delaware's attempts to bus students in an effort to integrate its schools. In a recently unearthed interview from 1975, Biden said, quote, "We've lost our bearings since the 1954 Brown v. School Board desegregation case. To desegregate is different than to integrate." He went on to say, quote, "The real problem with busing is that you take white people who aren't racist, people who are good citizens, who believe in equal education opportunity, and you stunt their children's intellectual growth by busing them to an inferior school," unquote. CNN recently revealed that in 1977, Biden wrote a letter to the segregationist Senator James Eastland thanking him for supporting his anti-busing legislation. We're joined now by the National Book Award-winning author Jonathan Kozol, whose recent article for The Nation is headlined, "When Joe Biden Collaborated with Segregationists." Kozol wrote this weeks before the latest Biden controversy. Jonathan Kozol is the author of many books, including Death at an Early Age, Savage Inequalities, The Shame of the Nation, and other books on race and education. He taught fifth grade for 2 years in Boston's suburban interdistrict program, the longest-lasting voluntary integration effort in the nation. Jonathan Kozol, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So you write this piece about the now presidential candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden's record with segregationists. And then this whole story blows up with Vice President Biden speaking at a fundraiser in New York for his presidential campaign, where he praised Eastland and Talmadge, the segregationist senators, and talked about the civility of the old days and said that Eastland didn't call him boy, he called him son, to the shock of many, especially African-American Senator Cory Booker, who talked about what it meant for African-American men to be called boy. Of course, Joe Biden, not an African-American. Jonathan Kozol, your response to all of this and what you feel the media has missed with Senator, Vice President, now presidential candidate Joe Biden's extensive record over the decades.
Well, Amy, the most troubling point from my point of view, and this is a point that most of the mainstream media has completely dodged or missed, is that, Joe Biden didn't simply reach out in consensus, some kind of civility to these Southern racist senators. It wasn't hard for him to reach out because he shared their views in the first place. He didn't just support legislation introduced by James Eastland or Jesse Helms. He thanked them for supporting his legislation and his own anti-busing legislation. He called busing asinine, and and more than and worse than that. At one point, he even came to the point of saying, I want to get his words exact, of saying, I've gotten to the point where I think our only recourse to eliminate busing is a constitutional amendment. Just stunning words. Last week he said he has no apologies. And the media, has quoted him repeatedly saying, I've been involved with civil rights my whole career. But this is simply, I don't know how to word this politely, but this is simply not the truth. To the extent that he's been involved with civil rights, it hasn't been as an advocate, it's been as an opponent. And, like other careful centrists, Biden threads the needle on the subject of diversity by saying that he favors it in principle. He simply opposes the only way in which to make it possible. In a nation in which residential segregation and redlining on the part of banks and mortgage lending institutions remain absolutely unabated, Biden knows absolutely well, he has to know, that by opposing the use of transportation, he's making school integration virtually impossible. And I'd go on just briefly for a moment about his antipathy to the bus, because it's remarkably selective antipathy. All over America, every single day, we see the good old yellow school bus stopping by the road to pick up kids in front of their homes and take them to school. And around 3 p.m, we see the bus again. Some of those buses, not enough, but some of them are transporting inner-city children from virtual apartheid schooling systems into very well-funded, beautiful schools in affluent suburban communities. Now, I'm very close to this issue because way back in the 1960s, I first taught for a year in inner-city Boston in a nightmarish school, a classic separate and unequal school. But a year or two after that, I was hired to teach in the first major inter-district integration program in the country, which involves today about 30 suburbs close to Boston. And I had a very close friend in that struggle, one of the activists in Boston, African-American woman named Julia Walker, who's now 86 years old. And she sent her kids and her grandkids, and now she has a few great-grandkids on the bus in that program to some really marvelous schools where 95% of the black kids who ride the bus, this is an amazing statistic, where more than 95% of the black and Latino kids who ride the bus have a 4-year high school graduation rate. As you compare to the classic segregated urban school where it's more like 60%. And the overwhelming majority of those kids go on to college, go on to 4-year colleges. I know a number of the first students in that program who went on to become teachers and are now the first black teachers in suburban public schools, so they can serve as role models for the next generation of kids. When I hear Joe Biden, stand up and say busing is a terrible mistake, it just breaks my heart. I mean, these aren't perfect programs, but the program in Boston, for example, has long had a waiting list of 15,000 children. And, the way I see it, as long as African-American and Latino parents who still believe in the dream of Dr. King are lining up to get their children into these programs, I don't want to see a Democratic nominee who's going to slam the gate in their face and lock them out. And he's said nothing to indicate that he's changed his
I want to
views.
go back to some of the things he's said that you also have pointed out to specifically address them. In October 1975, U.S. News & World Report published a special feature on busing featuring political leaders with opposing views on the issue. Ed Brooke argued in favor of busing, Joe Biden against. When asked whether busing caused more harm than good, Biden replied, quote, "Absolutely. It implies that blacks have no reason to be proud of their inheritance and their own culture." In a recently unearthed interview from 75, Biden said, quote, "We've lost our bearings since 1954 Brown v. School Board desegregation case. To desegregate is different than to integrate." He went on to say the real problem with busing is that you take white people who aren't racist, people who are good citizens, who believe in equal education opportunity, and you stunt their children's intellectual growth by busing them to an inferior school. Again, those are the words of Joe Biden, and it will be very interesting. Go ahead.
I mean, the notion that a school in which black and white children or children of multiple ethnicities sit together in class is doomed to be an inferior school is what I find most offensive and ignorant. It's simply not so. His concern for the stunting of white children is awfully selective. The stunting of black children in badly underfunded, often physically decrepit, disgusting, separate and unequal schools doesn't seem to elicit the same sense of alarm. You know, I'm 82 years old. I've been at this since I was 28, and I find it almost unbearable to see a Democratic candidate who has been willing through the years to trample on the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer, Thurgood Marshall, of those three young men, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, who went down to Mississippi in 1964 to try to break the back of apartheid and gave their lives for their beliefs. And when Biden, he's very good at waffling, depending on what audience he's in front of. The talk he gave last week about developing an amicable relationship with the Southern racists, he gave that talk in front of a group of very wealthy donors at a fancy party, a fundraising party. I think it was at the Hotel Carlyle in New York. I wonder if he dared to give that same speech in front of an audience of young black and Hispanic voters.
Interestingly, he gave that talk last Tuesday night. Wednesday was Juneteenth, the day enslaved African Americans in Texas learned of the Emancipation Proclamation and were freed. That day, Juneteenth, there were two historic hearings on Capitol Hill. One was around poverty and extreme racism in this country that was led by the Reverend Barber. The other was hearing the first in 12 years on reparations. The lead-off speaker was Ta-Nehisi Coates, and the next morning we spoke to Ta-Nehisi, the critically acclaimed writer, about Joe Biden's comments.
Joe Biden says that he's been involved with civil rights his entire career. It's worth remembering Joe Biden opposed busing and bragged about it. In the 1970s, Joe Biden, is on the record as being to the right of actually the New Democrats in the 1990s on the issue of mass incarceration. Wanted more people sentenced to the death penalty. Wanted more jails. And so, I'm not surprised. I mean, this is who Joe Biden is. There's that saying, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them. This is who Joe Biden is.
And Ta-Nehisi Coates went on to say Joe Biden shouldn't be president. The New York Times says, while segregation was once most severe in the former states of the Confederacy, in 2016 it was in 4 liberal states, New York, California, Maryland, and Illinois, that black children were most likely to attend intensely segregated schools. Latinos were most likely to attend intensely segregated schools in California, New York, Texas, and New Jersey. New York, California, Maryland, and Illinois, the most severe school segregation in 2016, Jonathan Kozol.
Yeah, well, there are 3 points about that. One is Biden didn't just agree with Southern segregationists. He, in a way, helped to let northern senators who might have been reasonable and enlightened on this issue, he helped to steer them away from integration, but he helped to give them a convenient rationale for not supporting integration in their schools. And he did it by saying that in the North, de jure segregation, de facto segregation was not intentional, and therefore could not justify court-ordered integration. In other words, it was just demographic happenstance that people happened to live on the opposite sides of town. And he also, on the subject of reparations, he was very clear. He said, I do not buy the concept that we have suppressed the black man for 300 years. No reference to black women. And he went on, and that as a result, that's my paraphrase, we have to give the black man a head start, which he inferred, actually stated, would hold the white man back. I mean, these are absolutely unspeakable positions. And, you know, if he had the courage to stand up today and not waffle about it, but say openly, I was totally wrong, forgive me, that might be reassuring, although because he changes his tune so frequently, one can't be sure.
Jonathan Kozol, we have to break, but I want to ask that you stay sitting there in the studio in Boston. We'd like to do part 2 of our conversation after the show, and we will post it under web exclusives at democracynow.org. Jonathan Kozol is the National Book Award-winning author of Death at an Early Age, also Savage Inequalities and The Shame of the Nation, among other books on race and education. We'll link to your piece in The Nation, When Joe Biden collaborated with segregationists. When we come back, we go to Oregon, where the state government is in a standoff after 11 Republican lawmakers supported by right-wing militias have fled the capital of Salem, Oregon, to avoid voting on landmark climate change legislation. Apparently, some have fled to Idaho. We'll speak with a Democratic lawmaker in Portland. Stay with us.
Private sector, for people in need of food and housing, for people in need of medical care. If unemployment is high where you are, then get it with the racist hiring practices. The private sector, the private sector, the private sector, the private sector. For people who found out about children's clothing, for people who care about pollution, the ones who check carcinogens in food, generous wages and auto safety. The private sector, the private sector, the private sector, the private sector. People who care about your future. People who care about your present. They've been held back by regulation. From here on in, dependent on them. The private sector, the private sector, the private sector.
The Private Sector by Stick Against Stone. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Oregon, where the state government's in a standoff after 11 Republican lawmakers fled the Capitol Thursday to avoid voting on landmark climate change bill. Some are believed to be hiding out in Idaho. In an unbelievable turn of events, threats of violence from right-wing militias supporting the rogue Republican legislators then led the remaining lawmakers in the Capitol to shut down the state Capitol building in Salem. It's now been nearly a week since all of Oregon's Republican senators went into hiding to prevent voting on the bill, which aims to decrease emissions by implementing a statewide cap-and-trade model. Without at least 2 of the rogue Republican senators present, Oregon Democrats, who control both the state Senate and House of Representatives, don't have the necessary quorum to vote on the legislation. Oregon Democratic Governor Kate Brown sent out the state police to track down the senators last week, but they have not returned to the Capitol. This is Oregon Republican Senator Brian Boquist, one of the lawmakers who fled the Capitol, speaking last week before the standoff began.
Sending the threat out like, oh, we're going to have a special session or I'm going to send the state police to arrest you. Well, I'm quotable. So here's the quote. This is what I told the superintendent. Send bachelors and come heavily armed. I'm not going to be a political prisoner in the state of Oregon. It's just that simple.
That was Oregon Republican State Senator Brian Boquist saying send bachelors and come heavily armed. Well, Oregon Governor Kate Brown said Monday she won't negotiate with the lawmakers until they return to the Capitol. For more, we go to Portland, Oregon, where we're joined by Oregon Democratic State Representative Karen Power. She's co-chair of the state's Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction and co-sponsor of the Cap and Trade Bill. Welcome to Democracy Now! What is going on in your state? Republican legislators, apparently some have fled to Idaho, and you've got the far-right militias threatening the state capitol, so it was shut down this weekend?
Yes, and our Democratic leadership in both the House and the Senate issued a statement last week condemning any threats of violence towards our state police and comments that would make our state capitol unsafe. And the Senate Republican leadership has set out to the media that they are not welcoming help from the militia, that their senators are out of state, but they have not condemned it as strongly as I myself and I think others would have liked, but they have distanced themselves from those militia comments as well.
But explain what is going on. So they're in Idaho, and how did far-right militias threaten the state capitol?
So earlier in session, the Senate Republicans walked out on their job to halt progress on passing a really significant landmark education funding bill as well. We have underfunded our schools in Oregon for about 20 years. When they walked out, our governor and the Senate Democratic leadership negotiated two bills that didn't move forward this session in exchange for their return to business for the rest of session. Now they've walked out again less than just a few weeks later. And I think the clip that you played earlier from Senator Boquist perhaps led to some of these militia groups stepping in to presumably defend our senators who are now out of state. But I think at least one other senator late last night said publicly that any threat of violence towards us as members, towards the public, is unacceptable.
And explain what this is all over. Talk about the climate change legislation you're pushing for.
Yeah, this is all over our climate bill. We've been working to study carbon pricing for the last almost a decade. Over the last couple of years, we've been working intensely on a cap and trade bill to align with California, Quebec, formerly Ontario, along the Western Climate Initiative. For the last 8 months, I've been helping to lead a terrific committee of both Republicans and Democrats as we've traveled the state to hear from citizens. It's coalesced into a final version of the bill that was going to be voted on by the Senate last Thursday when the Republicans walked out denying them quorum.
And explain that cap and trade bill.
We are seeking to regulate the largest carbon and carbon equivalent polluters in the state, and pricing carbon a little bit to start with the way that California has started, but Oregon would be the second state in the nation to price all sectors, our production, our transportation, and our energy and utilities. It's been a tremendous amount of work to get us this far. We have a number of groups in all major utilities in support. And it's really just incredibly disappointing that with the climate crisis before us, we were unable to take this last step and get it to our governor's desk.
So what happens now? Oregon Democrats have tweeted out a wanted poster for the missing GOP senators last week. Wanted fugitives from justice and their jobs. Have you seen these people? If you do find them, do not harm them. Oregon needs them back at work. 5 seconds, Karen.
Sure. Our session ends June 30th, this Sunday. So if they don't come back, all bills will be dead.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. We're going to continue with part 2 of our discussion. We'll post it online at democracynow.org. Karen Power, Democratic State Representative.